Joseph, it has been a couple of weeks since we have spoken, thanks to my Easter vacation. But it's good to see you. And you have, I
Good
don't,
to see you.
and you have an article from the New Yorker, I believe, by James Carroll that you would like to discuss. And the title
Yes.
is "This Easter is Christianity Still Promulgating Anti-Semitism? The gospel narratives of the passion and death of Jesus have, across centuries, framed how Jews are perceived." Um, and the first thought I had when you sent me this, um, uh, normally our Good Friday services here at Annandale United Methodist Church are some variation of the seven last words. And so like seven homilies with pieces of music. And so I've done other, so I've done seven Old Testament prefigurations. I've done the seven I am statements in the Gospel of John. But this year, we didn't do that. And instead I had just a single homily. And then to fill out the service, because we still had all this music, I read the Passion story in the Gospel of John in its entirety. And it's been a long time since I've done that in the context of worship. And the artistry in which the story is told struck me again. But also, I found myself flinching at a few points reading it. And so I think, yeah. So I think this is a good article and a good question to not rush past.
So let me take the word you used, because you choose your words. When the pastor flinches, is there an intentional tug with the flock? Are you flinching in order to model what you would like the congregation to do?
No, I think I was flinching because, I don't want, as I'm reading, I'm thinking in my head, I don't want this to be heard in the way that it could be heard and has been heard. And it just, and it's part of the reason why, right? There's too many churches that just do liturgy on Good Friday and don't have a sermon. And I think the Passion story itself is a good example that you can't just read it. Not only because the story is not self-interpreting, but because there are things going on in the text that explain John's characterization of the Jews. But if you don't know the history of John's own community, you can hear that in a way that does damage and is antichrist.
And I think Carroll, who is a significant representative, uniquely someone who was Catholic and a part of the institution, and then came to understand that he had to do something both inside and outside that Catholic institution in order not to bear the burden of that institution's anti-Jewish past. So his great addition to our relationship is Constantine's Sword. Both the book and the documentary. I was surprised that he would write, and he obviously has access to a platform like the New Yorker, that he would write now, the Easter during the conflict, to reflect upon classic anti-Jewish scriptural issues. And to hear my dialogue partner say, I flinched, And what we did in Lent, what you invited me to do on Palm Sunday, is to give your congregation access to, please don't take any of this for granted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you mean what you say by coming, by being present in the church, in preparation for Easter during Lent, in preparation for Holy Week, in the penultimate moment of Good Friday, be careful. And I think there are times when Christianity has decided the risk of warning people to be careful requires a moment of critical self-reflection that sometimes pastors don't want to spend time with.
Yeah. Yeah. And James Carroll, as you mentioned, is Catholic, and and a whole other layer to this too is there are traditions of reading the New Testament, in particular its characterization of the Jews and the Pharisees, and then layering that reading over top our history of the Reformation, such that Catholics then become the new Pharisees,
Right.
and Luther becomes the new Paul,
And
and so then,
right.
so then historically, that's allowed Protestants to be both anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic.
Right. And that Protestants are much, much, much more committed to engaging the scriptural text
Mm-hmm.
rather than, quote, the theological or the outside philosophical or the so-called, what does the tradition say?
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm engaged in dialogue with Protestants, we share scripture much more. When I've been engaged in dialogue with Catholics, we get much more involved with theology.
That's interesting. And he in this
So,
article, I just want to in this article, James Carroll makes the point that it's not just how the Jews are characterized in the Passion story. It's part of a broader reading of the gospel that presents Jesus as a teacher of mercy and grace, that is discontinuous with his own tradition and past. And I think in a mainline Christian tradition like the United Methodist Church, that's where I see anti-Semitism rear its head more, in this sort of Jesus the good teacher, kind of a low Christology, anthropological take on Jesus that is inadvertently anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish.
well, right. I think what Carroll helps anyone do is to stop just at the burden of the term the Jews, because that idiom can't be without the scriptural overlays to it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use the term the Jews at any point in history and today without carrying from it all of those layers that he well describes in the different structures of the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Who are the Jews? We don't have that idiom, the Christians, the Muslims. But you say, and people think they understand, the Jews. And
Yeah.
I've experienced it since October 7th.
Yeah.
People say the Jews, thinking somehow the Israelis, the Zionists, and it's just easier, quicker, and dangerously dangerously much more hateful to say the Jews.
Mm-hmm. The phrase appears 140 times in the Gospels and the Book of Acts, Carol notes. So it's unavoidable.
And we never talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Just that idiom. What is it that we think we mean when we're reading it? Whether it's from that painful scene of Pilate, and what is it that the gospel wants us to leave with? Who is responsible?
Yeah, it's in some ways it's just lazy reading to read the Gospel of John, say, and come away with a single answer to why did Jesus die. You know, that it's from scene to scene. It's so clearly John is so clearly wanting to implicate everyone involved, from Caiaphas to Pilate to the crowd, right, to Jesus's closest friends, but the betrayal is as simple as you followed this Prince of Peace for 3 years, but for some reason you have a sword with you in the Garden of Gethsemane. So you almost have to want to blame the Jews, to see the Jews as the antagonists in the story. But at the same time,
and I think,
oh, go ahead.
No, go on.
I just lost my train of thought, so go ahead.
Carol, I always appreciate Carol's ability to deal with history as a part of reading scripture. So he does then say, and as Christianity developed, the role of the Jews changed dramatically. It was the Jews that didn't accept the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
It was the Jews that were no longer going to be the credible source of how Jesus is understood. Because once Christianity is able to create a Trinitarian incarnation, what difference does it make that Jesus, the Judean, was a Jew?
Yeah.
Now the Jews represent something very different.
Mm-hmm. I thought there's no page number here. I was challenged by him arguing that part of that historical development is the emergence of a high Christological understanding of Jesus, which had the effect of downplaying Jesus's Judaism. And so he says a divine Jesus would have been, in essence, a pretend Jew. And so and I think certainly pastors who go to seminary are trained to understand that you can't have a high Christology that lets go of Jesus's humanity in terms of incarnational theology, but that humanity is always framed in a general way. It's not that you can't let his Judaism slip away.
That's it. And the more developed and the more sophisticated philosophically the high Christology becomes, the more universal. And now we don't have to talk about the particularity of his humanity as a Judean or a Jew.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of that. part of that too, I think, so that goes back to like a particular Protestant reading of the New Testament that emphasizes the message of grace, right? And so you then
Mhm.
don't know how to connect Paul's understanding of the church's mission to the Gentiles as being a part of that universality is itself a part of the promise to Israel. I don't know that preachers are articulate enough in making those connections, myself included.
And that came much later. That's not something that is easily accessible in the history of Christianity's development.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more difficult to find a particularity to quote the historical Jesus while simultaneously preaching the universal salvific promise of a Jesus that is white and European. And why would there be any particularity to that?
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, when I said I flinched on Good Friday, one of the things I was left reflecting on is the challenge. So the challenge for Christians to proclaim these texts that are inherently polemical in a way that comports with the peace of Christ. And so I don't know that Christians think often about the polemical nature of most of the texts that make up the New Testament.
And I think in part, what we've been doing for the last 5.5 months, what Lent did, how is your community coping with your new involvement, bringing a rabbinic presence and voice into their Christianity?
I mean, I got a little pushback on both ends of the ideological spectrum, but by and large, I think people have come to trust and appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you. But yes, today the risk you take in involving me is both on the right and the left. And what is the risk of becoming a model for finding a place in between those two extremes?
Well, and I mean, I think underneath it all really is the challenge of, what Karl Barth would call election. It really is the challenge that the true God has chosen this particular people whom you represent, and because I belong to the church, I have a relationship with you that is inviolable, whether I want it to be. That I have a relationship with you, and you have a necessity for me that is different than just some other religious person.
Right.
And so over the course of our conversations, one of the pushbacks I've gotten repeatedly is, well, why aren't you speaking with a Palestinian? Why aren't you speaking with a Palestinian Christian? Why aren't you speaking with a Muslim? And on the one hand, I understand, like, I'm not opposed to dialogue. But the question in itself, I think, reflects a lack of clarity about the uniqueness of from a Christian understanding, the necessity of our relationship and solidarity.
And it's not either or.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of our dialogue, which I have craved and members of the Jewish community draw upon as a source of calm that here is a Christian who is telling us, yes, being Jewish / Zionist, being someone who has been terrified by Hamas, I can be present to that in our conversations.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for a United Methodist minister to attempt a conversation with Muslims for whom the state of Israel remains so problematic, inherently problematic? How would that dialogue go? What, what are you sharing?
Mm-hmm.
We we come at our differences with an honesty in which neither of us is threatened. I'm not opposed and have dialogue both with Muslims and Palestinians, but I have to make sure that the conversation is a statement of affirmation that we are both present.
Mm-hmm.
What I think has happened in the globe is October 7th is an example of terrorism, a group that says you're not present. Our purpose in existence is to deny your presence. So, yes, I'm proud to participate in a conversation that models the possibility of any dialogue. Because increasingly, as we move toward November, I think dialogue will become less and less praiseworthy. It will, people will look and why are you doing this?
Yeah.
And
So one of the things,
I think to be able to take a passage like Carol has taken and to permit each other to take the risk of being in dialogue as he urges us, much like the Nicholson essay from a few weeks ago. Nothing is as important to me about the future possibilities of liberal, small l, democratic values than finding ways to dialogue.
so there's no way of talking about this without talking about the present, as you've
Right.
done, and that's where Carroll ends up. And so, towards the end of the article, he writes an ancient bipolarity that still readily puts Jews on the negative side of a culture wide structure of imagination is hard to define precisely in present terms, particularly in the context of the war in Gaza. The suffering of Gazan civilians, stalked now by the imminent threat of famine and further destruction, must be paramount in the conscience of the world, and pressure from Washington on Netanyahu's government to stop its assault must reflect that. But the consequences of the origin story slander remain. In the U.S., far-right hate groups have long traded in anti-Jewish tropes, and in recent years that trend has been accelerating. The more mainstream right has tended to muddle the issue. After a neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Donald Trump found very fine people on both sides. Evangelicals in the Republican Party have embraced Netanyahu and made his purposes, even as a strand of their faith quietly holds on to an end-of-days anti-Judaism. But in the current heat, expressions of anxiety about rising anti-Semitism have been taken by some on the left as just a deflection of criticism of Israel's invasion of Gaza. Opposing Israel's government is not anti-Semitism, and neither is supporting Palestinian freedom and autonomy. But though Israel has enjoyed broad support in America since it was attacked by Hamas on October 7th, a new anti-Jewish energy has decidedly been set loose.
Um, I am not where I was on October 7th, 8th, 31st, November 10th, 15th. Uh, I'm getting ready for the Seder, which will be on the 22nd of April. The Seder begins with a passage from the Babylonian Talmud in which we are to open the door or open the window and you use that then to uh, call out and say, Halach ma'onya, holding up a piece of matzah. This is the bread of affliction. Let all who are hungry come and eat. After the meal is eaten and the grace after meals is said, you open the door and invite in Elijah, the harbinger of the messianic promise. So it begins and ends with opening the door from the private family to the public realm. I'm fascinated by that this year. I don't think Jews feel safe to open the door anywhere,
Yeah.
Jason. What does that mean? How are we to understand that challenge? Those of us who are committed to the unique survival of Judaism and Jewish life are going to this year leave an open seat at every Seder table for one of the hostages symbolically that has not been returned. The Israeli government does not represent Israel and it does not represent the Jewish people. It is a disgusting collective of ideas that is purely transactional in a 21st century corruption of political values. You can't remove the prime minister because he was not elected by the Israeli public. He was elected within a unique, specific political party, Likud, the government created as a coalition in order to establish a minimum of 62 seats.
Do you think part of the public relations disaster that this is that a lot of Americans just don't understand the basis of Netanyahu's power?
Yes. For a people that has achieved in so many different ways and categories and ideas, the modern Hebrew word hasbara, public relations, publicity, we have for 75 years failed again and again and again in not being able to explain who we are. It's complex. It's a parliamentary democracy borrowed from England. No constitution. Always, we don't have time. And a person who is venal, who is tragically so self-consumed that he knows with a final plan to end this conflict, he's out, he's done. So there's no vision, no moral access to why he should end this. And the people understand now. He will fight rather than bring the hostages back. The devastation and all of the components of that devastation, physical, hunger, illness, It's unconscionable. And there's no way to create any possible justification, even as we continue to try to understand October 7th. Since we've last spoken, there has been an award given for Photo of the Year. It's given within the University of Missouri School of Journalism. This year, the Photo of the Year was given to the Associated Press for a photo taken during the final elements of the October 7th massacre. Photo is of a corpse, unidentifiable corpse, at the back of a pickup with Hamas warriors. The corpse would later be visually used in Gaza City. It's a young woman who was at the music festival. She was, in her death, partially decapitated. Within a week, 10 days, her family was notified that she was dead and not a hostage. They took a dead body back, a corpse, back to Gaza because of its value as a leverage for ransom.
Yeah.
It's a new definition of what's intolerable. I'm not using this or any other example of October 7th as an explanation or justification for the Israeli prosecution of this conflict. The Jewish people has not yet integrated that photo. Should it be given an award? If you go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., there are sometimes videos behind waist-high barriers. You have to look at the videos being seen, and some of them are of naked women being pushed toward a ravine and shot by Nazis. And it was determined that for matters of modesty, that such videos not just be made immediately accessible. I don't know how long it will take all of us to get past October 7th. The world has forgotten that an eliminationist terrorist organization initiated this conflict, broke the previous ceasefire. What does it mean for the Jews of 2024 to now defend this? Yeah. I can't defend it. But we're stuck then with what Carol notes. It's an inclusive idiom over which I have no control. I'm included in the idiom. Yeah. The Jews. I don't know. I think Carol is right. Here we are once again looking at what the Jews have done. And I have no answer. I can't and won't ever defend anything Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have done. I defend unconditionally the Jewish people and its right to survive. Okay. We don't have a discourse available for this. The two of us have been reasonably able to find a discourse in our podcasts, in the Lenten study. And I will continue to participate in the hope that we are modeling to everybody, including those on the two extremes, that the only way we can get past October 7th, the many conflicts in North America, is to take the time to have a relationship and dialogue. Without the dialogue, we are left with meaningless, screaming tantrums. And I don't know, what will that mean? What will the next 6 weeks mean to have a criminal prosecution of a former president of the United States? I mean, if I just take that for a moment, even 2 Samuel 11 and 12, something we studied together in our Lenten series, even as crass as that scriptural text is, it doesn't quite meet the standard of what Trump did in order to cover up this adultery. And now it's a criminal case in which he has threatened the daughter of the judge. Is there a discourse available? How do we explain how this is to each other? I'm reading what people experienced during the eclipse, 4 minutes and 14 seconds of natural darkness. Maybe it was so powerful because there's so little in our lives that makes us have awe.
Yeah, I was on a plane during the eclipse, so I didn't see it, but listening to people's reaction to it, it's a yeah, it's a reminder of how we've allowed the world to become disenchanted.
Great. I mean, it was fabulous. I watched the NASA live feed here in Rio de Janeiro, for which I had access to nothing. Okay, and it was great, but universally transformational? I mean, can we put it in a context? But maybe that's what we're supposed to learn. We need to be, as Heschel said, in awe. But we've lost access to awe.
So you mentioned November and the political climate and the looming trials of the former guy and all that. Carol brings it up here in the article, but specifically, I guess my question would be, so A, how do you react to all the Jewish tropes that people like Marjorie Taylor Greene throw around, like the Soros funded, that phrase, and what do you want Christians to do about those?
Sometimes I laugh that there is a person who was elected, albeit from a small enclave of other people, and that she is literally called a representative. And what does she represent? Who? What? So I have to keep reminding myself that she is a snapshot of the zeitgeist. And we have to learn from that. She can be a single anomaly, or you can allow her to be inappropriately given more representation. Okay, I don't know what to do with her. You can't argue with that threshold of exaggerated, it's like the dinner table scene from Beetlejuice. Okay, it's a movie about a ghost. Let's put it in perspective. And if you think it is reality, it's a short conversation. I'm not in the conversation with you because I can't participate. How do I want Christians? I want the Christians with whom we've been engaging, who I've not yet met, but we're on the other side of my teaching, our podcasts, my sermon. I want them to take the time and take the risk of saying the following: there are not good people on both sides of every experience.
And that's
there weren't at Charlottesville, and that's a part of the Virginia with whom I'm speaking. And maybe had the world stopped and said to him right then and there, no, this is unacceptable. The President of the United States cannot, should not say there are good people on both sides. No, this is not who we are. But we didn't. And I don't know why we didn't. And lots of people don't like the polarization. And they think the best way to help the polarization is disengage from the realities of the polarization. I can't agree. You have to take sides. I have a little card on my, it's time to choose. Good, evil, don't know. No, we who lay claim to a religious sense of purpose, a teleology, we are not allowed to be neutral. There is nothing in Scripture that permits neutrality.
Yeah. I was
now.
Yeah.
We've become encumbered by those choices, and then we flinch. And we have to come up with rereadings. What do I want from Christians? To be Christian.
Yeah, the Stanley Hauerwas, the Christian theologian, has a couple of essays with provocative titles. But his point is that Christianity is unintelligible without enemies. And that, like that if sin is simply that which God does not want done, to disengage it and remain neutral is the opposite of faith.
Not permissible. Simply not permissible. Look, in Leviticus 16, the annual purification rite on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, there are two goats. One goat slaughtered by the priests for the sake of the sins. Simple, got it. It's the other goat, the goat for Azazel. The goat on which the priest puts their hands to literally impose upon the animal the sins of the whole community. And that goat is chased out of the temple, out of Jerusalem, ultimately off a cliff. That goat is the origin of the scapegoat. We can't find enough scapegoats today. We are recreating the scapegoats at every turn. But they're not carrying our sins. We're using them for blame and shame.
Hmm.
And it's going to take some people who have platforms to say, if we're going to get to November, could we share a discourse? Because we have to be somewhere on November 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, not just the 5th.
So you're telling me that between now and November, I need to initiate some sort of dialogue with a red hat wearing "Make America Great Again" trooper?
I don't know that you have to. I think there are people probably who want to support those policies. They may not wear MAGA hats. How are we going to heal and be present to each other after both extremes continue to stimulate chaos, which is intentional?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Both sides only want the disruption of chaos. I thought that was in part of why James Carroll decided, I think I'm going to write about what I've already written about, but I'm going to write about it again now to remind people about the cost of disruptive chaos.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good that
We need our energy. We need to guide and be present to each other, because the disruptive chaos is leaving lots and lots and lots of people in a different kind of famine, a spiritual and intellectual famine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is a kind of I don't know, despair, nihilism. I think that it informs a lot of outrageous and extreme behavior in our politics. I mean, that's I don't know if you saw that Atlantic article last week that got passed around a lot about the social costs when people disconnect from churches. That you've got to find connection and meaning somewhere else.
Yep. Look, the classic book that we can keep coming back to, Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
Okay, that inability to reconstitute community. Yeah. We used to be able to count on our churches, synagogues, mosques, our schools. No, they're not accessible to us anymore. They aren't where your parents grew up. Your grandparents knew this was a good place to be in community. Okay, where do we have community today? We have community on social media. So the value of the Carroll essay, as the two of us look back on the investment we made in a Lenten series and a Palm Sunday sermon, is we took the risk of modeling the investment of a relationship. Differences in generation, differences in not just faith, but differences in a sense of why we are doing this. And we're finding a way to sustain the relationship. I think we're going to need more and more of this. There are parts of the Jewish community that I won't be in dialogue with anymore, the ultra-Orthodox. And how do we admit there are parts of our community that we want nothing to do with? So it would be interesting for people to read Carroll, to engage in the obvious. And he makes it clear this was supposed to be done. Why is this not done?
Yeah. Well, Joseph, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you. I appreciate it. And we'll find some more and different ideas in order to keep the conversation going.
Yeah. I'll save my question for next week because I think that could take a while to answer.
Are you going to let me think about the question or surprise me with the question?